Welcome to the third webinar of AI Connect 2. It was so nice to see so many of you at the first regional workshop in Ho Chi Minh City last month. Thank you so much for joining us. We are also starting to share some information with some of you regarding upcoming external conferences. And as a reminder, if there are specific conferences, particularly in your region, that you would like to bring to our attention for sponsoring travel, please share those with myself, Caroline, and Emily so that we could review those. A quick note on the structure of the panel. It'll be 45 minutes of discussion, followed by 15 minutes for questions. And a note to the audience, please feel free to drop your questions during the discussion as well, as they're fresh on your mind and we can get to them either in the course of the discussion itself or during the question and answer portion. All right, now last month we had folks from the OECD and working in multilateral affairs, Karen Persay from OECD, Yoichi Ida, Justin Fair, and Mark Latonero walk us through US efforts as well as international governance processes on responsible AI. But what does responsible AI mean and what does it constitute? So this is our first webinar delving into specific OECD principles, particularly human-centered AI. This is OECD Principle 1.2 on human-centered values and fairness, which states that AI actors should respect the rule of law, human rights, democratic and human-centered values throughout the AI system's life cycle. We have an excellent panel of speakers to help us delve into the specifics of what human-centered AI would mean in practice. We're joined by Lilian Olivia Herrero, who is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and an award-winning writer based in Nairobi. She is the founder of Safe Online Women Kenya and a fellow at the DataSphere Initiative. Olivia has published on a range of gendered issues pertaining to women's access to online spaces, and she also holds advanced human rights certificates on the rights to privacy from the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, as well as a postgraduate diploma in law from the Kenya School of Law and a Bachelor of Law from Moi University. Welcome, Lilian. We're also joined by Venkatesh Krishnamurthy. Venkatesh leads on policy issues around personal data protection, privacy, cybersecurity, cloud adoption, and emerging technologies in India for BSA, the Software Alliance. One of his key focus areas is cross-border data flows, and pushback against data localization mandates. And he specializes in roles that play at the intersection of business, government, and society. And finally, we are joined by Avi Fuller. Avi is the Global Policy Director at Credo AI, a company focused on adopting responsible AI at scale. Prior to joining Credo AI, Avi served as the advisor for digital economy policy at the delegation of the European Union to the United States. And she's also been affiliated with the Information Technology Industry Council, the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee at the US Department of Commerce, and the Transatlantic Business Council. Thank you for joining us today, Avi. My first question is to Avi. As you're looking at this landscape of just broad responsible AI principles, how do you see the executive order on AI and advancing racial equity, as well as the blueprint on the AI Bill of Rights, both important documents coming out of the Biden administration, influencing the development and adoption of human-centered AI principles in this sector?
Yeah, thank you, Trisha, for the question. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'll try to speak up. I'm very soft-spoken, so just put a note in the chat if you cannot hear me. Thank you so much to the Atlanta Council for hosting this discussion today. I'm really excited to be engaging with this cohort from AI Connect. I think thinking about the executive order that was issued at the beginning of President Biden's current presidential term. So in January of 2021, the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government was one of the first indications from this administration of a whole of government equity agenda. So it didn't explicitly reference artificial intelligence, but it stated that advancing equity requires a systematic approach to embedding fairness through all federal agencies. So this was really an early signal of the intention of the administration to take this issue very seriously. And in October of 2022, we had the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which was constructed as a set of 5 principles and associated practices to help guide the design and development of AI in a way that ensured it protected the rights of the American public. And I think that this emphasis was really striking, particularly in October of 2022, at the time, ensuring that there was a focus on sorry, there's a pop-up on my speaking language, but I'll go with English. At the time, the blueprint was really instrumental in focusing on human rights protections, particularly as a signal from the U.S. administration that it was taking this very seriously. The European Union already had fundamental human rights enshrined, including privacy in the Fundamental Human Rights Charter. But I think that the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights really indicated the U.S. focus on enshrining principles such as privacy for the American public as well. So this was a really interesting signal that the enterprise was taking very seriously, and industry took very seriously, and still does to this day. So the 5 principles outlined in the blueprint are protection from unsafe or ineffective AI systems, protection from discrimination by algorithms, and assurance that AI systems are used and designed in an equitable way, protection from abusive data practices, and agency over how data about you is used, notice and explanation when an automated system is being used, including how and why it contributes to outcomes that impact you, and lastly, human alternatives, considerations, and redress, including the ability to opt out where appropriate. So at the time, as I mentioned, the blueprint was very aligned with the European Commission's 2019 non-binding ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, which also emphasize this human-centric approach and are based in the former treaties of the European Union, including their Charter of Fundamental Human Rights. So rooting the approach to AI design, development, and deployment in respect for human dignity, a human-centric approach, I think it is really notable, particularly building on the existing OECD 2019 recommendation on artificial intelligence. Then we have the executive order from 2023, which was further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. This is really indicative of the administration's intention to task federal agencies to ensure that their own processes are in alignment with this whole of government approach to human-centric AI. This included having the elevation of civil rights offices by directing their most senior civil rights officer to report directly to the agency head, and ensuring that the civil rights offices are consulted on decisions regarding the design, development, acquisition, and use of AI. So while it may seem operational, it's actually very important that these types of roles are elevated and given that opportunity to be instrumental in particularly the acquisition of AI at federal agencies. So in this way, I think the first 2 executive orders that really focused on this, as in conjunction with the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, gave the Biden administration that whole of government systemic approach to human-centric AI, and elevated the role of civil rights offices in their standing in this consultation on AI design and acquisition. In the present day now, I think what's most impactful, particularly for enterprises, and which we encounter very frequently in our engagement with customers, is the NIST AI risk management framework, as well as the executive order from October of last year on safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence, combined with the OMB's recent memorandum on advancing governance, innovation, and risk management for agency use of artificial intelligence. These 3 sort of, I guess I would refer to them as legislative or regulatory actions, are truly the critical levers of accountability for AI development in the United States. And I think what we have seen is that there is still crossover between the US approach outlined in these executive orders and the OMB memorandum with approaches like the European Union with the EU AI Act. So there is a mutual consideration of what constitutes high risk AI and different approaches to mitigating high risk. So when we're talking about, how is enterprise thinking about human-centric AI and trustworthy AI development, I think that these pieces from the Biden administration are really critical in first assessing what constitutes high-risk AI and where there are particular human rights concerns or particular risks that need to be addressed, particular human rights protections that should be part of the design and development stage for AI. And then how do you introduce transparency and accountability in those stages? So happy to go into more detail on each of those pieces, but I'll pause there.
Thanks, Avi. I've been trying to fiercely drop links in the chat as you've been speaking, because yes, the Biden administration has put out a flurry of documents in the past year that are relevant to industry implementation of AI. I might have missed a couple, but hopefully that's useful for the audience. I'll move on to Lillian next. As a lawyer, how do you define human-centered AI in your work, particularly as you're thinking about this in the context of gender equality and accessibility for marginalized communities?
Thank you so much, Trisha. So I'd start by saying data is to AI what food is to humans. And I'll speak from the African perspective. And when I think about human-centered AI, what it means to like the global South and particularly for Africa. So algorithms are typically developed in the global North, and they are trained on data sets that are very different from the African context. So this already in itself brings about exclusion of marginalized communities such as women. So when I think about how AI systems are being developed in Africa, I ask myself, is there inclusivity? Is there diversity in the design and implementation? And so when we're looking at gender equality and even accessibility for marginalized communities, then human-centered AI means, one, we are incorporating designs, ideas that are already into existing in the AI methodologies. So for instance, are we looking at the social cultural context and even values of our communities or the area we want to deploy these AI systems? Secondly, when I think about a human-centered AI, I want to first identify the infrastructural barriers such as limited telecom infrastructure and even power supply. And therefore, that in itself will necessitate having comprehensive AI policies that look into governance and even oversight measures. Then third is how ethical principles and even guidelines based on the community's values are being addressed in the specific AI related modules. So in the context of Africa, we already have challenges that historically would exclude marginalized communities or even women. So are we having ethical principles in deploying, for instance, AI systems that are addressing these challenges? And so to our designers, what can you do indeed to adopt a human-centered approach? So the first thing is just ensure that you have an understanding of your user's experience. So for instance, you want to deploy an AI system in Africa. Have you conducted in-depth user research? Do you understand what it means with the various forms of biases that would emanate from the AI systems, such as algorithmic bias or even confirmation bias? And so from a legal point of view, I'm also trying to see what guidelines or ethical AI development mechanisms are there to ensure fairness, transparency, and even privacy. Then finally, I'd insist on cultural sensitivity, including cultural norms and practices in the AI systems modules. because if we're going to talk about human-centered AI, then it means we have to put human well-being at the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. All very important points. You touched on so many issues that we don't regularly think of, especially in the global north, like infrastructure barriers, understanding the way users are actually going to be using these systems. All of these are very important points. Venkatesh, what steps do you think industry organizations or industry players should take to ensure that, one, their AI systems are complying with legal requirements in other geographies, and also upholding core human rights principles, especially in jurisdictions where there's very limited regulatory oversight?
Thank you, Trisha, and thanks for organizing this program to both Atlantic Council and CDP. It's a great initiative. I mean, the two parts to the question, I think the first part that you talked about is we are at the cusp of rapid advancements in AI, and that's of course a great opportunity for users, businesses to leverage these solutions, because today AI solutions are being more consumer focused on the consumer, where a consumer can use it right away in their social media posts, wherever that opportunity lies. So that innovation is great to see. That was the starting point for my intervention, because in a sense, you're trying to promote that innovation while mitigating, addressing the risks that could potentially come about. So for companies, the challenge today is to balance that both across legislations that's coming out. AV mentioned many policy frameworks, if I would call them, that are coming out of the Biden administrations right now. Similarly, I mean, EU, in fact, has looked at a comprehensive act legislation itself. So that's the AI Act. In other markets, like in Japan and Singapore, in India, they're all at framework stage. There's no hard and fast policy yet. So companies are actively trying to understand how these policy frameworks apply to them. When I say that, I mean the challenge right now for companies is to understand what aspect of that legislation that a government has imposed is applicable to them. Because what we see is there is the AI value chain, if you could call it that, and there are different actors in this value chain. So there's a designer, a developer, a deployer. What's the distinction? What would be the roles and responsibilities of these different stakeholders, players within the value chain, so that they can effectively address those risks, right? So, I mean, just to take an example, if you are developing an AI application that sits on a banking software, which is then sold to the bank finally, the bank might understand how the risks are sort of playing out, what biases are creeping in at the final stage, what mistakes are being made by the AI assistant. The developer will have a different sense of it. The deployer will have a different sense of. So the obligations have to be appropriate to the stakeholder. So that's how the companies are trying to understand the laws. That's vaguely to address the first part of your question. But the second part is, of course, more challenging, and it's rapidly evolving. How are companies addressing some aspects of, say, bias, discrimination, privacy, which would all be at the center of the discussion when it comes to human-centered AI on their own through corporate safeguards. So BSA has put together a slew of initiatives. So we worked on two big items. I'll paste the chat. So recently we came out with something called the BSA AI Policy Solutions for Building Responsible AI. So that's something that we worked on. It's a comprehensive document with 12 pillars on different aspects. Yeah, it's tough to sort of shrink it into a few pillars, but I'll just start with that. The other document that we worked on a few years ago, which is one of my favorite, is the risk management framework for building trust in AI that specifically worked on bias. I mean, just to pick one issue, that's bias, and we worked on that extensively, and NIST then came out with a similar framework. So from here, I think what I would want to highlight in my initial remarks is corporate governance safeguards. That would be what organizations can work on, how they can promote accountability by identifying and mitigating risks. So the delineation of roles comes in that. So the AI bias risk management framework is a guidance for companies to voluntarily adopt such a framework. Now you can take that framework and adopt it at any stage of the software development lifecycle process. So whether it's design, develop, deploy, and then how do you engage with the customers? What kind of trust and confidence building measures do you bring with the customers so that you can use it for something like that? How do you engage with vendors? So those are all conversations that can be instituted through a similar governance framework. I mean, not the same one. So I mean, that just gives you a sense of how we are approaching the issue as BSA, how industry can approach the issue for that matter as well. I mean, I'll stop there and see if there are any questions, and then.
Thanks, Venkatesh, and thanks also for dropping those links. I read one of those two, and I'll definitely read the other one as well. Very comprehensive documents, both. So we've been talking about human-centered AI somewhat in the abstract till now. I wanted to ask each of you if there's a place you've seen human-centered design in action that you think would be like a useful example as we're thinking about this. So I saw an interesting comment recently talking about our phone cameras and how that is a really good example of human-centered design in that we can easily control the settings, but at the same time, there's some automations that step in, like stabilization, to help produce a better product at the end. We can start with Avi.
Thank you, Trisha. I think it's a great question. Kind of building on your last question and tying the two together, I think human-centric AI really depends on a good outline from regulators in different jurisdictions of the risks and harms that they're trying to address, because there's so much of this field that could be considered a little bit subjective or values-based. So I think it's important to bring us back to what the process looks like for AI governance. I think human-centric AI is the end result, but focusing on the process to get there allows for more flexibility in terms of how to address this in different jurisdictions, how to determine what your thresholds of acceptable risk are, and really where you're going to have trade-offs. Because in thinking about AI models in particular, and their extreme volatility and ability to change, it's important to think about what you are calibrating that model for, because there may be things where you want a particular outcome that could be considered a biased outcome, but it's intentional in that you want to see that result from the model. So when you're asking about human-centric AI, and the best example of that, I think I kind of want to bring it back to the common ground of what we see regulators in different jurisdictions asking for from developers and deployers. Venkatesh mentioned the entire AI value chain, and I think it's really important to consider that. And I would say that the common ground that we have seen emerge is really about 7 principles. The first is creating an AI registry or inventory. So having complete oversight at an enterprise or at an organization or an agency of all the AI that you're using. That's really, I think, a key element for developing human-centric AI is being able to have visibility into where AI is being used. AI system tests is something that we have seen quite a bit throughout all regulatory requirements. System tests for performance, robustness, and accuracy, enabling human oversight, enabling independent evaluation, usage of AI impact assessments, both pre and post deployment, giving the opportunity for public notice and transparency, and ongoing AI risk management. So it's a long-winded answer. Sorry for that, but I think that that's probably, in my view, the best example of how regulators can really instigate this human-centric AI across so many different use cases and design phases.
Thanks, Ivy. Really interesting points there. And of course, it's the point of panels is to be long-winded. I'm sure all of this information is really useful to everybody listening. And Lillian.
Thanks so much, Trisha. I'd like to give examples in FAST Makerere University in Uganda. So this is an institution that is trying to understand and mitigate gender biases in AI systems, especially when it comes to automatic speech recognition systems. And so that is an example of a project or a research that is trying to have a data-driven approach and build a framework and guidelines for mitigation and gender bias when it comes to automatic speech recognition. So you find that when institutions or organizations decide to invest in local research to understand ways of mitigating gender biases, that is also a human-centric approach. Another example I'd like to give is like conducting ethical impact assessments. So we have a project in Kenya in the Dedan Kimathi University of Technology that is really trying to investigate the ethical purpose and societal benefit of AI application when it comes to ensuring gender equality in the STEM field for women and girls. So those are some of the practical examples of how AI human-centric approach is being used in Africa.
Thanks, Lillian. And if you're able to, could you also just drop the names of those two projects in the chat so that the AI Connect participants can also look those up? Venkatesh.
Thanks. So it's an interesting question. So, I mean, the way I understood it was, sort of something in the real life that people can see where these are playing out. It's one place where we are seeing it play out quite at the moment is during the election cycle in across countries, right? So where we are seeing misinformation or disinformation, especially in the context of AI that's playing out. So this has become a challenge for regulators purely because of the harms that it could potentially give for users, sometimes even elected representatives. So one way industry is trying to come together to solve that challenge is through an initiative called the Content Authenticity Initiative. Basically, how can you solve the challenge for provenance or provide an audit trail, if you could call it that, or a metadata for how a data packet or a video or something goes through, what is the journey that video takes. And so if a particular content has been synthetic content, as we call it, if that synthetic content has been unduly altered, you have a trail which can be looked at. So if a particular engine is working on it and there's an output that engine gives which is not, if it's inappropriate for a particular or it's causing harm, then we can go back. So that is a case of there is a problem in the current context, and what is the solution that the industry is coming out with. So the standard is called the C2PA standard. So the initiative is the Content Authenticity Initiative. The standard is something that any deployer or of a solution or a product can use. It's available online. It's an open standard. So, people can look into it. I'll paste those initiatives on chat.
Thanks, Venkatesh. And in fact, you've kind of teed us up for one of the upcoming webinars, which is on AI explainability, where we do plan to go into detail on emerging methods of content authentication and provenance. All right. So we've been talking a lot about industry initiatives and industry taking a cue from government. I wanted to kind of flip that as well. One, how should industry be collaborating with government agencies and other stakeholders in the development of guidelines for human-centered AI design and development? So where are there opportunities for cross-pollination, including from industry experience as well, given that there's already been plenty of experimentation in this field. AB, we can start with you.
Absolutely. I think one of the things we talk a lot about in our day-to-day work is the unique aspects of AI risk. So most enterprises that we work with are very familiar with handling privacy risk and cybersecurity risk, but there are still a lot of questions about the risks that are specific to AI models. So I think one way that enterprise should continue to work with government and regulators is bringing those issues to the forefront and explaining basically the unique aspects of AI models and the challenges that they present to governance, to auditing, to certification, and coming up together, I think, with a path forward is really critical. We don't want to be in a situation where enterprises are too afraid to utilize AI and are not adopting AI because they're concerned about a lack of clarity or unable to understand regulation. So I think this remains one of the most important areas for collaboration, is really sharing information about AI models with regulators and vice versa, talking about the risks and harms that regulators are most interested in ensuring are addressed. One of the things that we have proposed, and I'm happy to link this in the chat as well, through various responses to RFIs with NIST and NTIA and OMB and OSTP, is the development of a taxonomy of risk specific to AI. So there are many ways that you can measure risk, but being able to jointly and clearly identify the risks for AI models and how regulators want to address them, I think starts with developing that taxonomy of risk. So there's a couple categories we've already identified that should be considered: abuse and misuse. So the potential for AI systems to be used maliciously or irresponsibly. This can include things like deepfakes, automated cyber attacks, and invasive surveillance. Compliance risk, so having AI systems violate laws and ethical guidelines. We've seen this principle also replicated at the supranational level. NATO issued principles of responsible use. One of those is lawfulness. So this taxonomy of risk should include that kind of consideration. So we've bucketed that as a compliance risk. Environmental and social impact, explainability and transparency, fairness and bias, long-term existential risks, certainly still part of the consideration for this taxonomy of risks, particular to AI. Performance and robustness, I already mentioned, are part of the testing requirements for AI systems, but being able to understand and assure the intended purpose of the AI system and its resilience to perturbations and unusual inputs is really a critical piece of this taxonomy. And then, as you've mentioned before, Trisha, as part of human-centric AI, the risk to privacy and risk to security. So I think in terms of enterprise collaboration, developing this joint taxonomy is really critical. And I think this might be another question we're going to address as well, but working together to address transparency reporting requirements, auditing and certification for companies that are designing and deploying AI is really an area where we need more enterprise and government collaboration. So developing what standards of good AI look like, jointly working on these standards. NIST is doing a great job with the AI risk management framework and the development of the generative AI profile, which really gives specific controls for enterprises that are looking to mitigate risk in those particular use cases. But again, talking about what good looks like and being very context, industry, and use case specific is another area I think where we need to see more collaboration.
Devi, what does good AI look like is definitely something that needs a little more work, especially since the technology itself is evolving pretty fast. We're already in a place where we wouldn't have seen ourselves even 5 years ago, but yes, a very important point there. Venkatesh, same question to you.
I mean, on areas of collaboration, right, between the government and stakeholders. I mean, just to rephrase the question. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. The question was on areas of collaboration, right, between the industry and government. Yeah. So definitely there are a couple of areas which would lay the foundation for such a collaboration in this particular aspect. At least some of the basics that would help in human-centric AI still go to strong, robust cybersecurity laws, privacy laws, and those are aspects that still have to be, those are bridges that still have to be covered by many governments across the world. So I wouldn't discount those from this conversation. And to drill down that basic rabbit, the set of basics that still need to be, the foundations that still need to be put forth is sound data innovation policies that would include, open data initiatives of governments to become a bit more, usable and clear to researchers who can use the data that the government provides, so that it even go down to minute details like the format in which that data is made public. Researchers are having challenges, industries having challenges to use the data that's available sometimes. So those basics still have to be sort of put together before we can embark on this journey of human-centric AI. The two other aspects that I would mention are continue to for the government to continue to invest heavily in R&D. That's two. One, initiatives that they do on their own that are allied with other areas, so quantum and compute, those initiatives. Secondly, R&D which involves joint collaborations or partnerships with other countries, specifically that would help countries that don't have already existing legislations on human-centric AI to learn or share. So, international account, you could look at some sort of a global harmonization on these issues. That's one part on R&D. And the second part is on workforce development. Governments across the world continue to battle this challenge, dual challenge of, innovation in AI needs to happen, but at the same time, workforce development is one of the things that we highlight in our documents, both in the framework and the AI bias management framework, and also the policy solutions document, is right from the design stage, you are looking at interdisciplinary teams that need to be groomed and developed. And that's one of the best ways to reduce a lot of bias issues around bias, discrimination, and make AI more human-centric. So if governments can focus on those aspects through the workforce development issues, that would be helpful. And there are two strands that we approach workforce development. One is ensuring that you train the STEM education training models are robustly funded. Secondly, every job is going to involve every digital job is going to involve AI. And every job is going to involve a bit of digital in it. And so how are you training workforces that are currently not digitally ready? So those are aspects also that can be looked at. So I think Lillian mentioned something quite early in the picture on the conversation around how can you look at, if the training model is not used in a particular country, but it's deployed there, how do you address those kind of issues? Those kind of issues are, of course, addressed by testing them in those countries, but also training the workforce there to adopt those models in advance so they can participate as the model grows, right? So I think those are aspects that I would want to highlight.
Thanks a lot, Venkatesh. I just wanted to check if Lillian is still here. Yes, great. Lillian, so there's a question addressed to you in the chat that I think would be relevant in the conversation that we're having right now, as we're also kind of contextualizing what human-centered AI means. And this is from Ferchel from Suriname, and he's asking, in thinking about human-centered design, we've seen several issues addressed through the course of this discussion, but what about the negative impact on the environment? How should those be addressed by policymakers? We often don't think of like environment and climate change as like a community and individual and human rights issue, but it is. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, Trisha. I'd even start by saying that one of the negative effects of using AI, for instance, is it needs a lot of electricity, or you need vast amounts of, water, and this can even develop biases against nature or even animals. So if you look at the consumption of, I'll just use maybe energy or even electricity when it comes to the impact now on the environment. Yes, we cannot run away from the fact that indeed there are negative implications to this. And this is where what the previous panelists have spoken about on interdisciplinary and collaboration comes to board, because we need now environmental impact assessments and even environmentalists to come on board in conversations around AI governance, regulations, and policies, so that we find a balance of how we can decide to use, for instance, e-waste, or find other mechanisms of dealing with the waste that comes as a result of the mass production of data. So I agree with that, and this will bring on board like an interdisciplinary mechanism to handle all this. Thank you.
Thanks, Lillian. And e-waste is other huge, massive problem, and that hasn't been sufficiently addressed in global governance processes either. But I feel like that can be another webinar on its own. Avi, I saw you nodding. Would you like to add on?
I think, again, being able to measure and mitigate these risks is the challenge that lies before us, particularly in this space, and having the ability to come up with metrics for how enterprises can demonstrate whether or not that they are taking real action to take this into consideration is, I think, one of the key challenges that we continue to face in this space. It's really relevant, I think, in many regards, not just environmental impact, but how can you demonstrate real commitment to organizational change to implement responsible and human-centric AI by design from the very beginning, I think is something that we need to continue talking about, and governments really play a key role here, because I think we've seen that the voluntary attitude towards enterprise just willingly developing responsible AI on their own is not going to be successful. And I think there was a lot we can learn from environmental activism and ESG issues, and how enterprise has been asked to really institute change organizationally that we can apply to accountable AI as well.
Thanks, Avi. I see that you're already putting in questions in the chat, which is great, because we will be opening up to questions from the audience soon. Just one last question before I turn to the burning ones that everybody else has dropped already. So human-centered AI requires organizational cultures, industry standards and commitments, government regulations, and like internal government coordination, all to really work in lockstep to ensure that the individual is elevated in these processes. From your vantage points, your respective vantage points, which area do you see within this melee as being the least developed, where you'd like to see more movement? Venkatesh, we can turn to you first.
Yeah, thanks. So I think there are definitely a couple of area. I mean, is the list that you mentioned in the questions sort of maybe I have an answer outside of it. The one answer that I felt would be quite important to work with, and this is also reflective of a question that came in the chat, was is global harmonization, where in organizations, countries, multilateral initiatives could come together, and there's always an opportunity to start there, because we've seen a couple of initiatives already come to fore. So one, I'm from Delhi, so the G20 initiative that happened last year tried to bring together governments to agree on some principles around AI, which proved a bit challenging. India is also trying to look at something along the same lines to the GPI initiative. Many of you have might know about it, the Global Partnership on AI. there's also initiatives around G7, which is quite, India is an observer, but the other countries are participating in it. So this is one area where I feel the coordination, while happening through multiple pillars, would require a steering council, if I could call it that, to facilitate greater interoperability. I remember, I think AV mentioned taxonomy. I think even agreeing on common taxonomy is a challenge. For example, if you say developer and deployer, that there is not a similar taxonomy in multiple jurisdictions. They have, say, intermediaries or something else. So that is proving a challenge when you take it to the courts, right? So who decides then? So those are challenges. So I do wish to see more coordination on that front.
Thanks, Venkatesh. Yes, it seems like, say, 10 years ago, no multilateral organization was addressing these issues with the urgency required, and suddenly everybody is, and now we don't know which one to pay more attention to. Lillian, we can turn to you. Would you like to share your thoughts on that question?
Yes, so I'd start by saying, first, I'd like to see an industry-specific framing of AI and its applications. So you find most of the time when we're talking about AI in the African context, it's generalized under terms such as ICT and technology. So for myself, I would recommend that policymakers indeed explicitly define what AI means for the industry. And by doing so, also ensure to have gender mainstreaming efforts while this is being integrated into the AI development process. Another thing that I'm thinking about is the Brussels effect when it comes to now AI national strategies. Countries in Africa, we have a few of them that already have existing national AI strategies. But the question is, are they context specific, or are we just copying and pasting what we're seeing in these other jurisdictions? And I tend to think that when it comes to now AI regulation, we are still lagging behind in that race. And the question is to regulate or not to regulate. But however, this still does not mean that we should not be part of conversations around, global discussions of AI regulation.
Thank you, Lillian. Then we can wind up that question with Ivy.
I think there have been so many good comments already from my fellow panelists, so I would say +1 to what has already been said. But again, having a focus and emphasis on AI literacy in every regard, I think is one of the most important things that we can do right now, and one of the most important steps. So I mentioned already the uniqueness of AI risks, but being able to have an understanding of that, both at enterprises and in government, so that there is real change instituted to how you're addressing these models and the way that they interact with each other and their variability, and the fact that they are very subject to change will help as you are developing a taxonomy of risk, as you're developing meaningful human oversight, when you're thinking about what public transparency and a method for redress means. It all depends on the ability to have that basic understanding of AI literacy and understanding the uniqueness of the models and the risks that are associated with them. So I think that's the most important task that lies ahead of us now. I would say one of the things we talk a lot about is the level of transparency reporting and disclosures that can be injected throughout the entire AI value chain is one area where we would love to see a lot more work and focus developing standards for what good looks like for these AI systems, but in particular requiring model level transparency disclosures from large language model providers and foundation model providers, and organization level process disclosures by those same providers.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. All right, so I see there's a lot of movement in the chat. We can start with this question from Asila from Sri Lanka. Interesting question. Do you feel that there's a higher degree of responsible for corporate industry users as they're closest to the data and AI use cases? Essentially saying, if industry has special responsibilities because of their access to these resources. Would anybody have initial thoughts on that? Venki, Ivy?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first and maybe just take a step. I'm trying to understand the question in terms of, I mean, number one, the technology is largely being developed today by industry, and that's means that responsibility should lie with industry, whether there are other stakeholders in the system who also have responsibility. So I wouldn't comment on that, but I'll start with the point that industry has responsibility. So if you see largely in the last year, overarching industry has been talking to the government in looking at different AI frameworks and models, proactively looking to address some of these concerns. So that's something that I'm conscious that the industry is doing, especially in the last year. The debate has changed. But the challenge is also that it is not possible for one player to move the needle on regulation framework, policy frameworks. So let's take a simple example of data availability, right? Today, industry might not be able to get data themselves. If it's a startup, they have to get data from government, from users, from another industry. Now, the tools of collection of data is dependent on the technology. So if it's 5G, 6G, the kind of data that, so it's a little bit more challenging, especially even if you take the simple intersection of AI versus data, the robustness of the data, the representativeness of the data, the bias that can creep in at every stage in data collection will be responsible. So so the industry is trying to solve for each and every one of those problems, but they will not be able to do it by themselves. Yeah.
Thanks, Venkatesh. AV.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to take a joint effort of enterprise, every level of enterprise, large and small, and in particular, a big role to play for governments instituting, mandatory requirements for how to be accountable, how to be transparent. Because as I said previously, I don't think that, voluntary codes of conduct are going to have the kind of effect that we want to see for enterprise at large developing AI responsibly, because it does take a significant financial investment, significant organizational change to make sure that this is a priority. I would say that I think with great power comes great responsibility, and there should be particular attention paid to large language model and foundation model providers and the amount of transparency and disclosure reporting that they are providing as companies that are very much at the top of that AI value chain, so that they can enable downstream developers, smaller companies, to also be transparent and to be able to accurately assess the models that they're using. So, being transparent about model architecture and the data that's used to design the AI system, being transparent about things like performance, robustness, accuracy of the AI system, I think is something that we should be asking enterprises to do, and hopefully really reinforcing that with standards development and enabling a marketplace of tool providers that can help companies make sure that they're being transparent in this way.
Thanks, Avi. I'd also just like to chime in to say that perhaps the answer to this question would differ a lot by geography. In India, for example, where Venkatesh is speaking from, the government is the largest holder of data, especially in special categories of data like geospatial data. And so there's a different level of responsibility and accountability required there versus in other markets like the United States. Lillian, would you like to also address that question?
Yes, I think from my vantage point, each stakeholder has a role to play, from the developers, regulatory bodies, governments, AI users, AI developers. So if we each play our role, then we'll indeed have an ecosystem that is working. But if one of the parties is not holding to their end of the bargain, then that's where we start having challenges around why is this not regulated, or why are we having all these risks arising from the AI applications.
Great. Thank you, Lillian. All right. Okay, so there's a question on intellectual property rights. Salma, would you mind explaining that question? Do you mean in terms of protecting of individual creators? Just clarify that, and we'll get to that question in due course.
Yes, we have been discussing in Mexico what happens if we use data that has not been allowed to be used. So what would the regulator do with these cases where we find that the data is not properly allowed to be used for algorithms and so on?
Okay. All right. So essentially talking about a dip in the quality of data because you can't access certain categories of data due to existing IPR protections.
Yes, there's also another question about if we should move on to protecting intellectual property rights for data when we are creating algorithms.
Okay. Would anybody like to take that question?
I mean,
Go ahead, Venkatesh.
no, I mean, so yeah, I mean, there are a couple of different discussion. The intersection between copyright and AI is fastly developing. There are many different thoughts and opinions out there, and companies are taking different courses as they developed as the large language models or internal models that they're working on. The first aspect is you strengthen the copyright law. That has to evolve. That discussion continues to happen. The second is another area of work where users and developers, I mean, users of there's a intersection of creator work on top of AI, and then you put out a new creative work, right? So how are you going to address that by copyright laws, existing copyright laws, or should you develop new laws to work on those issues? Because both of them will then decide how would you balance out both innovation that has to happen using AI, but at the same time protect copyright, protect creative artists, developers from materials that they have developed independently on their own. So it is a tricky, it's a challenging terrain. Many countries are trying to evaluate how to do both. And that would involve making sure that the development, the updates to the Copyright Act that they will do, plus the AI policy frameworks that the institutes go hand in hand, and they have to develop simultaneously. So that's what we are at least observing across jurisdictions.
Avi.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I'm not an intellectual property rights lawyer, so I can only answer from my perspective, which would be ensuring that there are transparent disclosures about how the model was trained, and the training data used is actually a critical piece of allowing governments that may be procuring or acquiring AI to make those decisions about trustworthy vendors, whether or not they agree with the training data set that was used, or how the data was collected, whether or not there were sufficient IP protections in place. And again, coming back to those guardrails requires a certain level of transparency and disclosure. So I think that that's a critical piece of this discussion.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Hernan. What are the most important aspects of human-centered AI when we talk about task automation? So the way I'm interpreting this question is like, if I'm a person using a system with AI on it, like what are the core principles that I'd like to see in the design of that system? Whether it just be making sure fail safes are easily accessible, points like that. Avi, Lillian, Venkatesh? Yeah.
Yeah, happy to start, unless Lillian wants to jump in. But I think when we're thinking about AI, again, it's always context, industry, and use case specific. So when you say human-centric AI, I think it's important to drill down on what that looks like for the particular human. And usually the acceptability of risk, or the particular risk thresholds, are going to be unique to that person, and unique to the application. So something we often talk about is you could be using AI for facial recognition on your phone to open your phone, and it may be acceptable to you that that model has a 80% accuracy rate. And sometimes it works to open your phone and sometimes it doesn't. But the risk and the harms and the impact are very different if you're talking about that same facial recognition system being used for Customs and Border Patrol or entry into a country. There you would want to have a very different threshold of accuracy, as close to 100% accuracy as you can ensure, because the risk and the harm are very different, very high. So when you're thinking about human-centric AI, it's important to think about the particular trade-offs of that use case. And again, I think I mentioned previously the commonalities of what's being considered high risk and highly impactful are an area where I think we need to see a lot more global collaboration and energy between governments to identify that common taxonomy of risk, different ways that we can introduce transparency for those systems, and even the categorization of those systems themselves as high risk or human rights impacting, safety impacting, so that enterprise can ensure that they are calibrating the models to account for those risk thresholds.
Great. Thank you, Avi. Yes, Venkatesh.
Yeah, so I mean, I'd like to pick I saw another question on high stake. I mean, so high stake area, the last question I think posted by Owais Zain Qureshi. So I saw the conversation that Avi was pointing out too. So what we also recommend is focus on high risk use cases of AI and policies that would address risks, specifically the high risk use cases. By that we mean even aspects like impact assessments being tailored to look at high risk cases. So what you would do during an impact assessment is to study the roles, responsibilities, processes of everybody in the ecosystem, those participating, different functions within the organization, users, vendors, so personnel responsible to so that entire ecosystem, but focus that study impact assessment on high risk use cases. Now the definition of risk could vary for a particular jurisdiction, but focusing on high risk uses. So facial recognition is a good example. So something similar could be in healthcare, but it need not be in healthcare. So I want to point to a counter example where, say, in healthcare, if you're using a scheduling application, AI application of when you need a doctor's appointment, that might not be high risk. So you don't need to regulate the whole sector or do impact assessment of the whole sector. You could evaluate only the high risk applications. So maybe if you're using an AI to decide whether a particular patient requires a particular kind of surgery based on parameters that you've evaluated, and the doctor gets an information based on that AI, then that could potentially be a high risk application of AI. And so we need to study that use case. So it is context dependent. And the uses of high risk AI has to be evaluated not sector wise, but maybe risk wise.
Thanks, Venkatesh. Lillian, the same question to you, but also there's a very interesting question in the chat about the choice to refuse an AI-related service. Because we're speaking of human-centered AI, the right to refusal is also a core right. And so how do we ensure that AI is not forced into contexts where it doesn't work? And then how do we then incorporate that choice or refusal into our thinking about human-centered AI?
I think that brings about the aspect of autonomy, whereby we have all these AI applications and it's upon us as users to decide which one we want to opt in or even opt out for. However, sometimes because of necessity, you find yourself automatically either using a facial recognition or a biometric system. So in that moment, would it sound like you're forced to it because you have to access maybe a public service or a digital good? So such questions would come about. And I also wanted to touch base in terms of the copyrights and AI. The issue that would come about is ownership in the legal context, because when you create AI created works, who owns it? And that would be the legal challenge in this case, because some people would argue that, of course, they are not humanly created. but who owns that work? So for legal practitioners, we are grappling with now finding that balance of who indeed would own it in the event that risk or harm comes about as a result of an AI application.
All right, thank you, Lillian. With that, we're pretty much out of time. I know there are some questions that we weren't able to get to, but I see that they're also very much related to future webinars, so we can address them there as well. Thank you so much for engaging in the chat. And thank you so much, Venkatesh, Avi, Lillian, for your great insights and for being with us this morning, afternoon, or evening.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thanks
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Right. So the webinar is not over. We do have breakout sessions afterwards to discuss some of the questions that have come up in the course of the panel. And before that, I'd like to turn to Dr. Jerry Metchling. Jerry is an independent consultant and a former faculty member of the Harvard Kennedy School, where he taught degree program courses on information management and founded Strategic Computing in the Public Sector, a research and executive education program. He's had many accolades, and you'll know him best as the implementer of the Ideas for Action sessions for AI Connect. He's going to be talking about what Ideas to Action is and how you all can engage. With that, I'll turn over to Jerry.
So I am delighted today to be here at the second year of the AI Connect program. And in particular, we're getting lots of ideas today, lots of ideas about, what does it really mean to have human-centered AI and who is doing what in that area and what might we do in that area. We're knowing always that there's a difference between learning about something and doing something with that, taking the idea and turning it into some kind of action, because it's the action that creates the value. That's a problem that all professional schools have had. I've happened to work for more than 30 years at Harvard University, where the classrooms can be large, the issues can be exciting, and the question always comes up is, who takes what of those ideas and turns it into something? That's very important for us and what we really want to focus on here. So why do we do this and what are we doing? And let me see if I can get this to work. I think it will. It's really about taking an idea and saying, where and how do you get the most value out of it? And there's really three things in general that are being used. One is analysis. We are people who have information, and if we can use that information to better predict the results of various actions, and not only the expected results, but what are the upside possibilities, the things that will move us into a position better than we're currently at, and what are the downside risks? If we understand that analysis better, we can make better choices and get better results. And the very interesting thing about us and about artificial intelligence is that there's huge changes that have recently come to play on how we can do analysis. The very important thing that a lot of people recognize but don't really recognize is that we've been getting more productive out of how we collect data, store data, communicate data, see the relationships in data over the last 50 years, called the information age. And in particular, in the last several years, where we're talking about artificial intelligence. So we've been doubling stuff. I've been working in this arena for maybe 50 years. And take 50 years of doubling, or let's go to 10 years ago, 40 years of doubling. How much more productive were we just 10 years ago than when I got started? Well, if you run those simple calculations out, you'll see that we're about 1 million times more productive 10 years ago than when I got started. And that means if $1 of investment in computing and data and analysis were to move you forward 1 inch 40 years ago, how much further does it move you now? Well, it moves you, now basically about 17 miles. There's a big difference between 1 inch and 17 miles. And that difference has happened most recently And that's really the reason everybody's now talking about artificial intelligence, is that the things that used to be so far in the future aren't there. The future is now. And where will we be 10 years from now? Well, we'll go up from 1 million times better than when I got started to 1 billion times. Not 17 miles, but 2,000 some miles, all the way from Boston to Los Angeles. If you know the American continent, that's just a huge thing. So we have analysis that we need to look at and understand because it's so different recently. And we then say, well, we create value because that kind of analysis can reach different people doing various things. There's 3 groups that tend to be very important about using analysis and producing it well. One is just us as individuals. To what degree are we personally able to utilize and take advantage and avoid the risks, but harvest the benefits of artificial intelligence? The key group, most likely, it has been and will continue to be, are known groups, organizations, places where there is a culture and a set of standardized procedures that simplify problems for improvement as to what you're searching for. And can artificial intelligence help take over some of those steps in value chains and improve things? That's very important. But a third group that will be very important, and we're reaching increasingly, are new groups. Not those that are inside organizations and those that we've worked with, but it's the cross-boundary, the multi-country, the global kinds of things that will be very important. So for those groups, and for value, how do we structure a learning curve that moves us from just thinking about things to doing things? Well, that curve, that standard S-shaped curve of learning, starts slow. To learn how to tie your shoelaces, it took me a long time back when I was 3 and 4 years old. But once you learn how to do that, you can do it much more quickly, and you disseminate that idea of productivity as far as it will go until you finally need new opportunities. We are now looking in ideas to action at how you get that learning effectively started. Let me turn that off. My apologies to all of you guys. But there we are. And so we're saying, if we are now at a time where the new learning is coming very, very quick, and where there's great importance in not missing the train, but also great risk in going too quickly, where is this ideas to action group most difficult and important for us? Well, there's a couple of things that are pretty simple. It's difficult when we're really still not certain. We don't know what the results will be. And particular flavor of that not knowing is just not knowing how big the benefits will be, but could it really be a severe risk? Because something that gets adopted by so many people so quickly can have an impact before we can come in and correct for the downside risks unless we respond quickly, understand, and are smart. And a lot of what we talked about today is that balance between going too fast and going too slow. But another thing that makes it difficult to do what we're trying to do is it's not just individual decisions, it's group decisions. And in groups, you have multiple stakeholders. And in some cases, the issues that those stakeholders will raise are not known. People like to hide those things, or conflicted. There's a negotiation to decide, how do we decide when we don't all agree? And those negotiations are critical in very many ways. Again, the hidden problem way, there's many meetings we've all been at where people will sit around the table and look at a new possibility and not tell you what the problems are with it, because they don't want to be seen as a naysayer or rocking the boat or not putting stuff forward, and lots of other reasons why they don't want everyone to know all of the things that they're thinking about early on. That's also true because much of what we have to resolve in order to collectively agree to do something is not just based on evidence about what objectively will influence our results and how might we measure them. But we all have opinions, and they're driven very strongly by emotions. And sometimes those emotions are very, very important and correct and will at least drive our behavior. We need to be able to work on those. So how can we close the gap? How can we better get started from early ideas on, human responsible AI and other issues? How do we get better? Well, these are things that professional schools have worked at for a long time. And there's some fairly simple guidelines, but they can be hard to apply. First of all, we have to be alert to what's new that's out there. And not only what's new that's out there and how it's being used, but what are the likely impacts? And as I mentioned before, it's not just the upside benefit that often draws our attention to this, but can we understand and avoid and recover from the downside risks? To do anything there requires that we find some information. We're getting lots of information in this program, but we need to find the information that will help us take action. Both developing models, large language models, and the kind of data and information search and sifting that's required to do that, but also to understand more clearly what the various opinions are of the various stakeholders who have to come together to decide for these sorts of things. So what we're trying to do often is analyze for the actions we could take and their upside and downside impacts, and particularly, again, for the three groups whose actions will change the world over the next decade and more. Individuals, what will you do? What will your organization, the place and the environment where you have the most influence, do? And how will the various organizations, particularly those that need to collaborate in a world where this stuff moves globally and quickly, how will external collaboration work when that requires the development of both culture, shared ideas that aren't put in law, but also standard operation procedures and the laws? How do we do that? Well, generally, we need to actively search for action, find allies, and commit often to the early test steps to say, how do we get started and what are the goals for that? And in this program, very much as in the university that I taught in for years and years and years, there's help for that. The way we taught most case study courses at Harvard and other places is to not just rely on lectures. We had lectures. I liked lectures. Some people also liked them, but they weren't as important as other things we did. But classically, you would give an assignment out for the study for the class we're going to have on Thursday. And not only did you give them the assignment, which was a case, and ask people to think about how they would analyze and act in that case, but you pulled them together into groups to talk about that case before they got to class. And the class wasn't just listening, it was you would be called upon to talk. You would not just be able to observe the class, you had to participate in the class. We were pushing people to get over that barrier between just listening and then engaging. We were giving term assignments. The happiest thing for a professor years later are those students that come back and say, oh, you remember that, term project I wrote on X? I was able to do X. Those are the basic, simple, but very important elements of moving from just being aware of what's going on that's new to grabbing hold of it, to seeing how it has to be adjusted to fit your environment, and then engaging. So the question is, what will you do and what comes next in ideas to action? Well, the way we're planning to work is to start on our real session on the 18th of June that's coming up. And before then, between now and then, we're going to ask you to be thinking about some ideas for yourself, for your agency, for collaboration with external folks for action. And after that, we will be discussing and choosing some possibilities so you can winnow down the incredible range of things that might be done into the things you're planning to do, to discuss those ideas multiple times with multiple people because that's what helps you and them get a better sense of what's real here. And then we will work to make things happen. That's the broad plan. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted you're going to be here. And let me just open up now for any questions that this might have had. Your turn.
Right. If any of the participants have any questions for Jerry, just feel free to drop them in the chat.
Or raise them. Let me see if I can get my mouse to work, which it hasn't been working very well today. The classic thing we used to do, of course, in large classes, even with 100 students, is just to randomly call on people if they weren't generating questions. But we will be working to not only help you select ideas that you want to push forward, but help you find teams to talk about those ideas with and get some feedback from the AI Connect staff and from me and others so that those ideas can be shaped and turned into testing actions and other actions. I'm going to stop my screen sharing right at the moment.
Looks like there's a question from Oves.
Yes. Hello, Jerry.
Hello.
It's a pleasure learning from you. So I just want to share my story that this is the same thing what me and my partner did back in 2016. We came up with a thing that we wanted to create the impact. So we started designing and developing the brain-controlled prosthetics. Then we incorporated the AI in that. And this is the same thing what we actually did, and we came onto the top with the national levels. We are good to compete in the global market, and now we are looking forward towards more aspects and how more impact we can do on global level. So this is the thing what I am working on. This is the thing what I would love to take as my case of study for this part as well, so that ultimately it will benefit me, it will benefit the global impact. And so this is how we can all together create a more inclusive society in terms of for those people who are living with a disability. So that, yes.
Sure. Delighted to hear about that project. It sounds important. I'm sure that other people now recognizing that project that you're doing may want to learn a bit from you, may have some ideas from you, may have ways to take that general idea and turn it into their own setting. One of the most important parts of this entire program is recognizing that artificial intelligence is getting a lot of action and interest, and it's going to have a big importance globally, and particularly in developing countries. And what voice will those countries have to make sure it fits in their environments, but that they can be heard well? That will take individual work, but it's also going to take a whole variety of projects to be assembled, people to go and to make sure their voice is heard. So thanks very much. Other ideas out there about our way forward. We're going to get started between now and June the 18th, but this entire program is designed to look at all the discussions across all the world that are taking place about AI and try to say, but what's actionable? What's really taking place that will make a difference? And what can you, your organization, and the groups you would want to collaborate do to make a contribution to action?
There are a few questions in the chat as well. So one is about how do you work with uncertainty if you're sitting in government? And there's also a question on essentially like who they can collaborate with in the action session, whether they can be another colleague from their own country.
Yes, How do you deal with uncertainty? Well, the first step most people do is to recognize that they have it. The second thing they tend to do is to know, to the extent that that makes them uncomfortable and becomes a barrier to taking action, is there some analysis that will help you reduce that uncertainty? And if the analysis today won't reduce that enough to help you get off the board and get into the arena, is there some simple steps, some test experience that you can run that will give you enough feedback? And very often that feedback will be not just, can you do it, but is there some group that will support you? Because the world of human endeavor runs on social groups. The thing that makes us incredibly different from other animal groups is that we have language and we can collaborate together with very large groups, and very large groups are shaping the world, and artificial intelligence is beginning to reach very large groups and will reshape the world. The question is how, and to what extent will the uncertainties that we now have be clarified enough that we can make smart choices about what to do and who to do it with. So we'll be trying to do that. As I mentioned, in university classes, we try to do that with discussion groups, with assignments, with term projects, with helping people find jobs at the end of all of this. That has been the basic process by which individuals get an idea and work with others to make something happen with that idea. That's what we want to do as well. We're not in a formal class. This is all voluntary. But we hope that we can get ideas, you know, like around human-centered artificial intelligence and the balance between regulation and what should the private sector be doing and the public sector, when should it be public and public together in collaboration, when should it be multinational in collaboration. Those are the kind of questions. Other ideas from the group? Any questions from the group?
There's a question from Lisa. We just have time for that one question and move to breakouts.
Okay, hi, Lisa.
Hi, Jerry. Thank you very much for all your ideas and also like knowledge. I'm from Costa Rica, so I am just wondering if this idea is also like fit in this session. So we are about to launch our strategy of AI. So maybe one of the things that we can start thinking is that how this strategy will be impacting several sectors. And one of the sectors that for me is very interesting is the industry, right? So maybe I am thinking that after launching this strategy plan, maybe we can have like a survey or something like that so that we can evaluate how the AI is impacting the industry in that sectors. And also we can do it also by the sector of education as well. But sometimes this strategy of the countries, and this is something that we discussed in the past webinar, that the country are like running and they are just like putting ideas because they are copying what other countries are doing, and they just put it in the plan and okay, that will be launched. But we do not know if that strategy is fitting in our country. I mean, in Costa Rica. So I don't know, it's just like an idea, but I wanted to make sure if that's maybe can we fit that needs in this session, or I can see all right.
That I think is a very good example of the kind of things we all do when we are thinking about a problem. We very often say, how do I understand the problem? But it's very important to get a peek at how others have similar problems and what they are doing. So is this a Costa Rica solution that could benefit from what's going on at the OECD or the US policies? But more important, how will it benefit from other people in Costa Rica or in Latin America or in the global South? You know, those questions are, when can you take a new idea of an action that might make sense and recognize that there's millions of those actions. You can't do all of them. You have to select some that are better than others. You have to prioritize. How do you go from the early awareness of a possibility to enough confidence that you're going to try it out and then get others with you to have an important action on it? In general, that's what we're all looking for. And we hope that the ideas to action segment of this coming year will be fun, will be useful, and particularly useful in helping you get in the water, to get beyond, oh, this is an interesting program. I sort of like to hear what's going on. I'm more generally aware of artificial intelligence and a number of the issues, to I'm making choices. I'm doing something. I'm doing something for me, my organization, my country, and the world. And it may not be the absolute best, but it's the best I can do now. And I'm thinking about it, and I'm turning from looking to doing. So I'm looking forward to this very much. And thanks, Tricia, for setting this time up. And we're looking forward for June the 18th. We'll communicate with you between now and then about some things we'd like you to think about so that we'll have a good session on the 18th. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jerry. And yes, we look forward to seeing all of you on the 18th, when we'll have our first ideas to action session. And ahead of that, we'll be sharing some information, including Jerry's contact information, if you'd like to get in touch with him ahead of that session.